It was December 3rd, 1976, Las Vegas Hilton. Elvis was halfway through Love Me Tender when he froze mid-verse. 20,000 people went silent as he stared into the crowd. There, under the spotlight, was Priscilla Presley, and what she was doing made Elvis forget every lyric he'd ever known. December 3rd, 1976. The Las Vegas Hilton was alive with gold light, sequins, and cigarette smoke. The crowd of 20,000 roared as the orchestra tuned. Somewhere in that noise, the king of rock and roll stood backstage, staring into the mirror, adjusting his white jumpsuit one last time. He looked tired. The kind of tired that doesn't show in the eyes until you're alone. Behind him, Jerry Schilling, his closest friend, noticed the silence. "You okay, E?" he asked. Elvis nodded, but it wasn't convincing. His reflection looked older than he felt inside. That winter, he'd been performing nearly every night. 2 shows a day. His doctor told him to slow down. The colonel told him to keep going. But tonight, something was off. He'd changed the set list just hours before. Instead of saving Love Me Tender for the finale, he wanted it early. No one questioned him, but everyone wondered why. As the house lights dimmed, the sound shifted, the kind of hush that feels like a held breath. From the first strum of the guitar, the crowd erupted. Elvis stepped into the light, sweat already beading on his forehead. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Evenin', ladies and gentlemen," he said, that southern drawl smooth as honey. "Let's make this one count." The orchestra began. The familiar melody of Love Me Tender floated through the air like a prayer. Fans swayed, some crying already, holding Polaroid cameras above their heads. From the stage, all Elvis could see was a sea of faces. Flashbulbs, tears, and the restless shimmer of Vegas glamour. Yet he kept searching, scanning the crowd like a man looking for something he'd lost years ago. Each lyric felt heavier than usual. "Love me tender, love me true." He paused, his voice trembling just slightly, the way it did when emotion sneaks in uninvited. Behind him, the sweet inspirations picked up the harmony. But his eyes stayed restless, darting through the crowd. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find, or who. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was regret. Or maybe it was that deep, quiet ache that never left him since the day Priscilla walked out of Graceland. For the audience, it was another flawless show. But for Elvis, it was something else entirely. Every lyric carried weight. Memories of her laughter in the kitchen, of Lisa Marie's tiny hands, of nights spent wondering what could have been different. Then, somewhere in that golden haze of faces, he thought he saw a familiar silhouette. Just for a second, a flicker of memory or maybe a ghost. He blinked, the spotlight stinging his eyes. The figure was gone. He forced himself to keep singing. "All my dreams fulfilled." His voice cracked slightly. It wasn't noticed by most. Just by Jerry, watching from the side curtain, his arms folded. The song ended to a wave of applause so thunderous it shook the chandeliers. Elvis nodded, smiled faintly, and wiped his brow with a white scarf. But inside, something felt different. That momentary flash, that half-second of recognition, wouldn't leave his mind. He whispered to himself as the band prepared for the next number. "Couldn't be," he murmured. "What if it was?" The lights dimmed again. The next song began, but Elvis couldn't focus. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of the drums. He felt the room spinning slightly, but it wasn't the lights. It was the feeling that someone from another life had just walked back into his present. What happens when the past you've buried walks back into the spotlight? Elvis was about to find out. Halfway through Love Me Tender, something shifted. Elvis's voice was steady, but his focus wasn't. The crowd blurred into light and color, until one face cut through it all like lightning through dark clouds. 4th row, center left. A woman in a simple black dress. Her hair caught the light just enough to make his heart stop. Priscilla. For a moment he thought he was seeing things. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe memory was playing tricks. But then the spotlight swung her way, and reality hit like a punch to the chest. It was her, unmistakable. She wasn't smiling. She was still calm, like she didn't want to steal attention. But her eyes, those eyes, hadn't changed. They carried 20 years of history. Elvis's throat tightened. He missed his cue. The music kept playing, but his lips froze halfway between the words. The audience didn't notice at first, but the sweet inspirations did. Their harmonies trailed off. The brass section hesitated. Jerry Schilling, watching from the wings, muttered, "Oh no, he's seen her." Elvis blinked hard, trying to keep the performance alive. But he couldn't look away. It wasn't just that she was there. It was what she was doing. Priscilla had her hands clasped around something white. A scarf. His scarf. The one he'd given her after their last night together at Graceland. The night they both cried but said nothing. The crowd began to whisper. Cameras flashed. People turned, curious about the woman who had made the king of rock and roll stop singing mid-verse. Elvis tried to continue, but his voice broke again. Wise men say... He couldn't finish. The room fell silent. 20,000 people felt it. The shift from performance to something personal, something sacred. Even the air conditioners stopped humming. For the first time in his career, Elvis Presley didn't know what to do next. He lowered his microphone, staring at her. The spotlight lingered. Security glanced at each other, unsure whether to intervene. But Elvis raised a hand, a small gesture that said don't. Their eyes locked. In that look lived everything unspoken. The love, the guilt, the years apart. Priscilla's expression wasn't angry. It wasn't even sad. It was forgiving. And that forgiveness hit harder than any insult ever could. The band slowly faded out, instruments lowering one by one until all that remained was the faint echo of the piano. Elvis whispered into the mic, "Lord have mercy." It wasn't part of the song. It was real. For a long, suspended moment, the Hilton showroom was completely still. The kind of stillness that only happens when thousands of people sense they're witnessing something history will never repeat. Priscilla didn't move. She didn't wave. She just held that white scarf close to her heart. Jerry Schilling said later, "That was the first time I ever saw Elvis truly afraid. Not of dying, not of the press, but of feeling too much in front of everyone." The stage lights dimmed slightly. Elvis turned away, trying to collect himself. He wiped his face with his sleeve, pretending it was sweat. But everyone knew. And when he turned back, the king of rock and roll wasn't smiling anymore. He looked human. He took one deep breath, trying to restart the show, but no sound came out. The band waited. The crowd waited. The cameras rolled. Then he did something no one in Las Vegas had ever seen before. He stopped the concert entirely. He took a step back from the mic, looked into the crowd, and whispered, "Priscilla." It wasn't part of the performance. It was confession. The audience gasped. Can you face the person who remembers the parts of you the world forgot? Elvis was about to try. The Hilton ballroom had never known silence like this. 20,000 people breathing, waiting, frozen. You could hear the buzz of the stage lights and the faint hum of the amplifiers. Even the casino downstairs, usually loud enough to seep through the floor, seemed to stop. Elvis stood still, one hand gripping the mic stand, the other pressed against his chest. His mouth was dry. He wanted to speak, but the words tangled somewhere between his heart and throat. Priscilla didn't look away. She rose slowly from her seat. The movement alone drew the attention of every person in the room. Even the security guards hesitated, unsure if they should move or let history play out. Her face glowed faintly under the spotlight, soft and unguarded. She wasn't wearing designer clothes or diamonds. Just that simple black dress and a calm expression that cut through every barrier of fame and time. She held up the white scarf, the same one he'd given her the night before she left Graceland, when he'd begged her not to go, but pride had tied his tongue. That scarf had seen tears, promises, and the end of their story. And now here it was again. The audience whispered. Cameras clicked. One fan in the balcony yelled, "We love you, Elvis." But even that felt out of place. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something else. Jerry Schilling leaned toward Charlie Hodge at the side curtain. "He's gonna break," Jerry whispered. "He can't hold it." Elvis swallowed hard. For a second, he thought about walking off stage. But something deeper rooted him there. Something between duty and destiny. He looked down at the scarf, then back at her. She nodded once, slow and understanding. That tiny gesture nearly undid him. The orchestra didn't dare play. The sweet inspirations stood frozen, eyes glistening. The air inside that ballroom felt heavy enough to touch. And then, just barely audible through the silence, Elvis said, "You kept it." The microphone caught it. The sound echoed through the hall. A murmur rippled through the audience, a mix of confusion and awe. Priscilla nodded again, her lips trembling just enough to reveal how hard this moment was for her too. "I never threw it away," she said softly, her voice shaking but clear enough to carry. "You gave it to me when you said, 'For when you miss me.' I thought I'd never see you again." The crowd inhaled as one. Elvis blinked, his lashes wet. He stepped forward one small step, and the spotlight followed. His guitar hung loose at his side. "Why tonight?" he asked quietly. "Why now?" Priscilla smiled, sad but peaceful. "Because it's time," she said. That sentence hit him harder than any lyric ever could. He took a deep breath and looked toward the crowd. Thousands of faces stared back, but all he saw was hers. Every mistake, every regret, every lonely night since 1973. All of it rushed back in one impossible wave. The audience could feel it too. They weren't watching a performance anymore. They were witnesses. Elvis finally exhaled, shaky but sure. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, forcing a smile. "I think the king just forgot his crown for a minute." Laughter bubbled up through the crowd, nervous but warm. He smiled faintly, the old charm flickering just enough to keep them breathing. But his eyes, those stayed locked on her. The orchestra began to stir, unsure whether to start again. Elvis shook his head slowly. "Hold it," he said. "Just hold it." Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "It's her." The audience leaned forward, hanging on every movement. The moment stretched like eternity wrapped in soundless seconds. Elvis gripped the microphone again. His hand shook. He looked at Priscilla one last time and said quietly, "Don't leave." The crowd didn't know if it was part of the show or something real. But in that second, they all felt it, the collision of love, regret, and something too fragile to name. What would you do if the ghost of your greatest heartbreak appeared in front of 20,000 witnesses? Elvis was about to find his answer. The microphone hissed with quiet static. Elvis stood motionless, staring at the woman who once knew every version of him. The dreamer, the husband, the father, the man behind the myth. "Priscilla," he said again, this time louder. The crowd gasped. 20,000 people held their breath, trying to figure out if what they were seeing was real. Then, in a voice as soft as the first note of a lullaby, she answered. "Elvis?" The sound of her name on his lips, the sound of his name on hers, met in midair like electricity. His hand trembled around the mic. The man who had faced riots, critics, and presidents now looked utterly defenseless. He tried to continue the show, to shift back into performer mode. But when the piano player hesitantly restarted "Love Me Tender," Elvis stopped him with a raised hand. "No," he said, voice cracking. "Not like that." Charlie Hodge blinked. "Boss, you okay?" Elvis didn't answer. Instead, he set his guitar down gently, almost reverently, and stepped forward to the very edge of the stage. The crowd's eyes followed his every move. He looked straight into the spotlight, squinting to see her clearly. "I can't sing this one alone," he said quietly into the microphone. The audience erupted with whispers and soft gasps. The brass section froze. The drummer stopped mid-beat. You could almost hear hearts pounding in the silence that followed. Charlie muttered to Jerry Schilling, "He's serious." And he was. Elvis looked at security and gave a simple order that would become legend. "Let her through." The words hit like thunder. For a moment, nobody moved, as if the room couldn't believe what it had just heard. Then, slowly, the guards stepped aside. The crowd parted down the center, leaving a clear path from the fourth row to the stage. Priscilla hesitated, one hand pressed to her chest. Then she stood. Every camera in the room turned toward her. Fans whispered prayers, cries, disbelief. Flashbulbs burst like tiny fireworks as she began to walk forward. Elvis's heart hammered so loud he could barely hear the noise around him. Each step she took seemed to rewind time, back through fame, heartbreak, and silence. When she reached the edge of the stage, Elvis extended his hand. His ring sparkled under the spotlight, the same one she'd helped him pick out in '68. She took his hand without hesitation, and for the first time in years they were face to face. He pulled her gently onto the stage. The crowd stood as one, an ocean of people who understood, without needing words, that they were witnessing something sacred. Elvis handed her the microphone. "You remember this one?" he asked softly. She nodded, smiling through tears. Every word. For a heartbeat, they said nothing else. The audience waited, breathless. The band stared, frozen between music and silence. Elvis looked around, then back at her. "You ready?" Priscilla wiped her eyes. "I've been ready since '73. He smiled, small but real. Then the orchestra started again, quietly, tentatively. The first notes of Love Me Tender filled the air. And as the spotlight held them both, time itself seemed to stop. Sometimes love doesn't need music, just silence brave enough to hold it. The first piano notes trembled through the room like soft rainfall. Elvis stood beside Priscilla under a single white spotlight. No pyrotechnics, no orchestra swell. Just the sound of two hearts trying to find each other again through music. The crowd was completely still. Some held hands. Some wiped their eyes. Nobody spoke. Priscilla gripped the microphone, her knuckles pale. Elvis glanced at her once, then began softly. "Love me tender, love me true." His voice cracked on the second line. It wasn't the exhaustion or the years of overwork. It was emotion, raw and unfiltered. She joined him. Her voice was quiet but sure, trembling at first, then blending perfectly into his tone. Together, they created a harmony so delicate it didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded remembered. Every note felt like an apology. The audience wasn't just watching a duet. They were watching two people rewriting the ending to their story. Elvis closed his eyes as he sang, but a single tear escaped and ran down his cheek. When he opened them again, he saw Priscilla looking at him, not as the legend, not as the myth, but as the man she once loved barefoot in the halls of Graceland. Halfway through the song, his voice faltered completely. The mic lowered. He shook his head slightly, overcome. The orchestra hesitated, unsure whether to continue. Priscilla stepped closer, whispering so only he could hear. "It's okay. I'll finish it." And she did. Her voice carried the final lines like a prayer, filling the cavernous Hilton showroom with warmth and ache. When she finished, Elvis couldn't hold it anymore. He reached out, gently brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb, a gesture so intimate it drew audible sobs from the audience. Then he leaned toward her microphone and whispered, "Thank you." Those two words said more than any love song ever could. For those few minutes, the man who'd been buried under fame, pills, and pressure was gone. What stood there was the boy from Tupelo, singing to the only woman who'd ever truly known him. Priscilla smiled, her own tears glimmering in the spotlight. "You always did make me cry," she said softly, her mic still on. The crowd laughed gently through their tears. Elvis chuckled too. A real laugh, not the stage version. It sounded lighter, freer. He looked around at the crowd, then back at her. "Guess we finally got the ending right," he said. The applause began slowly, as if people were afraid to break the spell. Then it swelled, thousands rising to their feet, clapping through tears, their ovation echoing like thunder. Elvis turned to Priscilla. "You did good," he said, voice thick with emotion. She smiled. "So did you, Aaron." That name, Aaron, hit him like sunlight through a storm. It was what she'd called him before the world called him the king.
Gelag het saking hesiat. Havend hjertat in 'n longtime. Sismelet agen loking uit at 'n audiense. Neiter havet jy. Ty bote stoetere hand in hand, absorbing te moment. Voor onze tere weer no scripts no managers no cameras dat materet. Jes twooplople woord saret a liefetime in front of strangers aan som of found voorgevenis in a song. Kan a single song heel eiers of selense. Taat neget 20,000 witnesses of dat het geld. Te spotlige dimmet. Te last note linge redelijke a hartbetere vissing te vaarde. Wen het finale dit, Elvis aan Priscilla weer een stilholding hands. Wen te final note vaardet, te krof den cheerig het awai. Te stoot in stinnet selense, vates wet, hartspounding. Ten slovlei te applause begaan, sof dat first ten riesing into a roer dat soek te wals of te las vegas Hilton. Elvis aan Priscilla weer stil hand in hand. Neiter wante toe breek te fonistion. Voor eiers fame had beeld wals between hem. Betonig het in der blinding liggets aan tremlingstrings, toese wals finale vel. Je reis zulling step het voorwaard from te wings, jy is glistening. Het sien Elvis perform at huis times bid neverlik het is. Dat wasn't afsonserd, he wilt sy later. Dat was a confession said to Mrs. Priscilla Lianet close antwispered, aus hult finesse te sof. Elvis look het at haar aansoek is jat gintlei. No, hoe nie. Dat was te sof. Sis me leed trouwgetiaars. De orchestra in sire wat to do began to riese from Tyrchires. De sweet inspirations dabit at Tyriaes. De Audinie staatstanding. Ten without award, Priscilla step het bak to waar te Styers liaring opstage. Elvis kag het haar wrist softlei. Don de sapper achein, hesait. Sis me leed sat lei. Not te stime. As je het te kroft erop het onze moere, not voor de missies, bid voor de moment. Te weerend klapping voor Elvis te star. Te weer klapping voor Elvis te man, te one woe had finale sovnes jaard. Te pres had no idea wat te maken of het bij morning, het Linus vil het neefstands across Amerika. Elvis stop so voor Priscilla kroft in tiaars. Te king sang voor eskien one lastime. Voetage of dat nig het spread across television, whisper het about by fans wo soore tyd nie verseen hem so iman, so vulnerable. Bootleg recordings bekame presetriasiris, scratch hy, imperfect tapes dat captured the most honest moment of his career. For Elvis, so meting sift het after dat nig het. He didn't act plain it to anyone. But his band noticed he was different, calmer, gentler. He talk het les about fame and more about people. He never perform het loof met tender achein. De song had done wat it was meant to do, it had close it as sirslet dat began in 1956 and ended dat December nigget in Las Vegas. Priscilla, eiers later, wild kal it te nigget voorgeveenis found ten bote. In interviews, ze seit, wene saaf me, he didn't see it te eiers te hert or te distance. He safte boy wo onze sang met dat song on te front steps of Grasseland. And voor a 5 minutes we weer tussen twee pople achein. Today dat wete scarf still of feindlike creaset from her hands sits behind glas at Grasseland. A smalle player jats, loof met tender te voorgeveenis nigget, Las Vegas Hilton, dek 3976. Visitors often stop and stare at it, ina ware taat a kajit loofe story liefes behind dat folded fabris. Some songs ent ontstage. Otters atjo voor een ver. In dat moment inder te liggets, Elvis dint jest see Priscilla. Hesave everything het lost, and everything dat still remain het. Hesafte gerelwoe onze hande tempenet bitter sandwikjes bevore agig in 56. Hesafte hang motor holding baby Lisa on te porch of Grasseland. Hesaf lauchter, hertbreek, and al te kite in between. Bid most of all, hesaf wat fame had taken from him, piase, privacy, and the chance to loofe without cameras waiting. Dat nigget, as te kroft verlet out, je reis shilling found Elvis sitting alone in his dressing room. The scarf Priscilla had held lay across his lap. He wasn't crying. He was smiling. How okay. Je rei as get soft lay. Elvis nodded. Ria, he said. Eerst finale sal haar achein. Ria lei sal haar. Outside fans weer stil singing loof met tender in te hotel halwys, tyr voetjies ashung op toe te syte. Elvis listen het kajt lei. He wees bereid, ty tank te sov in dit wente liggets wend uit. Bid forme het jest startet achen. Wenn het dit eiget monds later, dat wete scar was found niet lei folded on his bedside table. People have argued for years about what he saw in that croft, whether it was forgiveness, love, or something deeper. Bid tose wo weer tere size at pressure told to try to better than words ever killed. He didn't see a broken mariage. He saw a live vallei levet. And my betats wat we al hope voor, dat one day, when the music stops, we can look back and finally understand what it was all for. Even kings gaan beïndone by te sig het of de one persoon wo kneef tem bevore te kroeven. If te strie to hart story moefet ou, sare het witte somione wo stil belief is in second chances. Bechause lofe, like missies, nie vir jylei eens, het jest weids voor te rig het verse to return. Tel is in te comments, have ou ever sien somione from our past and felt time stop. Wat lofe to hier our story.